Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Before we begin, a small admin announcement for regular subscribers to the show. If you were wondering why you've had to wait for longer than normal for this episode, then I've got a treat for you. As well as this, you can also listen to a brand new version of the second show I ever did. That features former FBI informant Tom Harden talking about his experiences. Since the episode is all about Tom's life, he and I thought it would be a good idea to re-record our 2019 discussion to take account of what he's been up to since then. There's a link to that in the show notes. You can also find it by scrolling back through past episodes or whatever player you're using. On this episode, I'm exploring the idea of communities. It's a concept we all intuitively understand when it comes to the places we live. We talk about our local community, and we all have community facilities like parks, swimming pools, and churches. But it's also highly relevant to work, because the same concepts that drive us to collaborate in our personal lives also apply to the workplace. Successful companies build communities amongst their employees, and in many cases, their customers. If you want an example of that, have a listen to my discussion with Lisa Richardson on the psychology of Peloton. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. My guest, Jean-Marc Le Tissier, specialises in building communities. He's worked across a range of industries, helping them to get better outcomes by channeling a sense of community spirit. Because whoever you are and wherever you are, you'll be part of a community, either physical or virtual. And if we want to get the best out of people and mitigate human risk, then we need to channel those dynamics. I found what Jean-Marc had to say was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure you will as well. So please enjoy my discussion with Jean-Marc Le Tissier on communities. Jean-Marc, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me here. It's fantastic.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Look, and I know who you are, but many of my listeners won't. Can you give us a little sort of pen portrait as to who you are and what you do?
So, Christian, where to begin? So, I'm Jean-Marc Le Tissier, and really I spent the last 30 plus years doing community building in one form or another. So, in a whole bunch of different contexts. So, bringing about change within organizations, whether it's bringing about global volunteering campaigns, my kind of focus and fun, frankly, has been in building communities of people who are really interested in making something happen.
Wow. And what is it? You say sort of building communities, but what are your areas of interest in doing that? Because that's obviously a fairly broad church.
So common themes are around collaboration and creativity and doing something which I think is, I suppose I personally believe in. So volunteering campaign, for example, would be, I recently did one that was promoting awareness of the challenges faced by women around the world in various occupations and raising money for that. But previous ones have focused on things which people might not think about as communities. So for many years, I worked with pharmaceutical companies on, how do you halve the time it takes to develop new drugs? And, it's an incredibly complex multinational process that crosses all sorts of professional and organizational boundaries. And the way to do that is to build a kind of community that's focused around that shared purpose and collaborate creatively to make that happen. And, we're seeing the kind of benefits, recently, very topically in the pandemic. These guys have got very good at figuring out how to do stuff fast.
And it's amazing when you sort of look at processes and structures that very often we've done things a certain way, and that kind of becomes perceived wisdom, and we inherit structures, processes, and approaches. And as you point out, there's plenty. I think there's lots up for grabs in terms of how we could do things better, how we could be smarter about things. And obviously there's technology, but there's also, I think, just sort of processes in the way that we look at solving problems and the way that we do that. And I think what's fascinating about the way you talk about things is that there's clearly a benefit to crowdsourcing, which is the whole point of the community piece. Get some people together, get some different perspectives, and try some new things. And I think, on the one hand, we naturally do that. On the other hand, there are lots of low-hanging fruit out there, as you point out, where if you look at how long does it take to approve drugs, and how long does it take to we've clearly seen under COVID, it can be done super fast if it has to. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting topics that one could grapple with that really deal with this piece of sort of saying, well, why do we do things the way that we do? Is there a better way that we could do them?
Yeah, so I mean, one way of looking at this is from a sort of historical perspective. And actually, my first degree was in history, so I guess I have that. So, going back in time, people naturally worked collaboratively in communities because it's the only way to survive and get anything done. And there was an acceptance that you had to do that if you wanted to achieve anything big. I mean, yes, you have a lone genius doing stuff, but anything kind of on a grand scale involves collaboration. And, community is a natural thing, and people want to do more than just kind of go to the grindstone each day. It also fulfills all those human needs. And then it kind of went seriously adrift come the Industrial Revolution. And, more recently, the kind of focus on essentially kind of production line manufacturing and command and control operations. And the development of project management, went off in a particularly strange path where, you've got project management really rearing its ugly head in the First World War in terms of logistics of getting the army to relative places and building bridges in time for troops to arrive, that kind of stuff. Latterly, project management given a big kick by things like the development of Polaris nuclear submarines. So, okay, great. But most of the time, you're not building a Polaris nuclear submarine and you're not trying to move troops around the place. And actually, having worked with the military, even if you did, it's still not a great way of doing it. So, there's an improvement to be done just in rethinking how do we do stuff that actually works rather than being trapped in we have to do it this way because this is the quote unquote proper way of doing stuff. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. One of the things I struggle with a lot is the kind of question people often ask me. It's like, well, how do you make huge things happen? And my challenge is, well, actually, that's a known thing. It's been known for years. The bigger problem is why do people continue to not do the ways that work and continue to stick with the ones that don't? I think that's a really interesting question that, I guess ultimately takes us back to leadership.
And I guess if, let's sort of riff off that a little bit, because it is fascinating. It's the reason these things don't happen, as you point out, is people. So we choose not to do things a certain way, and we choose to do them a certain way. And so I'm fascinated by, you sort of mentioned leadership as a driver there. Can you unpick that a little bit more as to what you mean? Because I sort of look at it and say, for me, it comes down to individual decision making. But you're absolutely right. That decision making is heavily driven by whoever is in the leadership position.
So I think to some extent it's things like self-concept. What is a leader and what do I as a leader have to do? A lot of it is around confidence and wanting to feel in control. So I completely get that. And a sense that, if I kind of let people, at the worst, a sense of if I let people off the leash, then I will lose control and I won't know what they're doing. I encounter that quite a lot. And so where I meet that head on is, look, in this given organization, you want to achieve the sort of stuff, you need to do it in a really kind of consultative, much more than consultative, participative community where people are joining in from all sorts of different disciplines and skills and levels in the organization, all this kind of stuff. And you're working very creatively and dynamically together and fast. Actually, these things are really fast. And I think for some leaders, there's this anxiety about, well, actually, I'm not the one driving it anymore. I've created this sort of network, if you like, which has almost a life of its own. And, some are comfortable with the idea that their role is to enable that and to nudge it and to unblock stuff. And I'm lucky enough to have worked for, decades now with some leaders like that. But there are other leaders who are really uncomfortable in that position. And to some extent, I guess that's that they haven't had the training or the opportunities to do that work and build the confidence. And there is this question for a lot of leaders I encounter, which is, what is my role? What am I here for? And I think we don't necessarily support leaders well enough in, how they can be their best and enable others to be their best.
And it's interesting when you look at sort of, what leadership models are we taught when we go to school? And we hear about, certainly when I was at school, sort of, historic battles and generals and politicians. Winston Churchill, good example, where it's sort of, lead from the front and courageous and big. And so I think the model that we take is that that's what you should be doing. That is how you should role model yourself. But of course, there are other leadership models out there, which is, for example, the conductor of an orchestra. who at no point is grabbing an instrument on their own, but is making, bringing people together and sort of facilitating and literally conducting as opposed to leading in a traditional sense. So I think these models exist, but it seems to me we've tended to push the models that are sort of strong leader equals good, Putin type imagery, if you like. And I think that sort of, misses a trick that, as you point out, is actually intuitively, we kind of know there are plenty of examples out there that we can observe where people working collaboratively works really well, and the sort of models. But we cleave to, I think, historically this model of strong leadership, and that's what leadership's about. And it fascinates me that I wonder whether something in the way we're educated and the historic examples and the things that we're told about tend to be those dominant figures as opposed to the conductor types.
Well, certainly there's this, I suppose I almost characterize it listening to you as a sort of macho posture thing around leadership. So actually only last week, a couple of women I'm working with actually asked me, for some steers on some leadership assessments they might do. And, I remain stuck in the problem I've had for years now, which is I really don't know where to point people because, most of the stuff around is pretty useless. And the only one I still point people at is a thing called the Leadership Practices Inventory, which is very well established and very robust, but also quite old, and which spells out really what it is to be a facilitative leader. That you need to inspire a shared vision and enable people to act. This sort of stuff. But that's not the thing that most people see knocking around. I see a lot of leadership frameworks from all sorts of organizations, which are pretty disastrous. They are promoting a view which is actually very old-fashioned and very sort of retrograde. It works against actually, building capability and enabling others. And the kind of watch outs when you see things like, oh, it must be decisive. And it's like, no, actually, you don't need to be decisive. You need to be discerning. And that's a process. And you don't need to just kind of tell people what to do and hold them to account. That's not going to work unless you do another key bit, which is enabling them. So there's a whole lot of stuff which is on a very practical level missing in that stuff. And also an emphasis on certain traits and characteristics that can be extremely, can really backfire quite badly. So I'm not sure where the macho stuff comes from. And there's a certain degree of nonsense, which I guess is promoted by the media or particular writers. Because actually, if you look at some of the leaders who are promoted as being these strong leaders and you really talk to people about what they did, that's not how they are to the people around them. They spend their time enabling those around them. So even people like Jobs, who was often characterized as quite abrasive, he had a challenging style, but he was most definitely enabling those around him. And the same is true of someone like Gates. And conversely, when they get a leader who doesn't do that, they really sort of fall over badly. So there's a kind of myth really promoted, I think. Some of these strong leaders, yes, they were strong characters. They might be quite strong, difficult personalities. But actually, if you really look closely at what they were doing, they weren't just ordering people around.
And how do you get the buy-in for your community-based approach? Because we've got this, if we have this backdrop of sort of, this is what leadership's all about, and these are the people, we need a lot of the things that you described in terms of the perception. And I think your depiction of sort of, what is Steve Jobs' reality versus Steve Jobs, the sort of the image, those are very, very different things. How do you get the buy-in of people when that's the prevailing mood? Are you going into situations where this idea of community leadership has been accepted? Are you bringing something fresh to it? How does that work?
So I've been lucky enough over the years to run into and kind of stay in contact with a bunch of people who are leaders and who've risen up the ranks, who I guess by nature of their experience of what's worked and what hasn't, or personal temperament, have come to this sort of position. But in other cases, it's true that it wouldn't be the natural default for what people want to do. But then there's a different argument, which is the simple, well, this works and that doesn't argument. So, so one particular one that I think we touched on before when we spoke separately to this, Christian, was this kind of huge global volunteering campaign. Now, they needed to scale participation from less than 100 people to nearly 50,000 in 4 months. And all that they knew was a very conventional command and control approach to doing stuff. They had never successfully pulled off a project globally using that approach. So they were quite freaked out by short timescales, by the nature of the challenge, and in not knowing what to do. And therefore, and this great credit to them, chose to embrace doing it a different way. And the way we went was by building this community. And it worked brilliantly. I kind of, I'm lucky because I'm able to point at loads of previous examples and say, well, this worked. Also, and this is something it's nice in a way I can say it because it's useful, I can say it, but I'm not happy to say it. I can also point to countless of examples of things that have failed because they didn't do it this way.
And I love that sort of, thinking about you point where it hasn't worked out. And what I find interesting about conventional wisdom is that very often we will just accept conventional wisdom, well, that must be right because that's the way they've always done things. That's the way I perceive they've always done things. And so when I come with my new, quote unquote, newfangled idea, it's sort of, that gets a great degree of skepticism and challenge and questioning, and you have to justify it. In a way, the traditional approaches don't, that's sort of accepted because that's the way we've always done things. That's okay. But you, with your new ideas, you need to come and provide me with some evidence that actually works.
Well, I'm reminded of that saying that common sense isn't so common as it. There's definitely no one got sacked for buying IBM syndrome. So I get into conversations where I'm saying to people, well, okay, this is the way you normally do it. Has that ever worked? No. And it's like, well, so how do you want to do it this time? Well, we're going to do it that way because that's our in-house method, or that's the certificated training or whatever it might be that we've signed up to. And if I do it by that process, I'll be okay. And I think then that leads us into a different space, which is to say there does need to be, at the end of the day, a real passion and determination to do something, that it is important. And, we might think about the grandiose thing like, improving conditions for women working around the world as a kind of big thing we can get behind. But it doesn't have to be that. It works equally well in a situation where, so for example, I've been working in a lot of reorganizations where the people are really passionate about creating an organization where they're proud to come to work, where they are regarded as the leaders by their customers, where they are equal partners rather than servants to the people that they're serving, and where they really care about what it is that they do. And even, really technical spaces that people might assume that doesn't happen, like IT departments. So there is this need that people actually want to care. And I think that is a big problem. So one of the things that I do is work with leadership teams around this. And I encounter some real, I'll give you an example of a really extreme case, because I think it makes the point. I was working with I won't name them, but a manufacturing company that you would know because they make things that everyone uses. And they wanted to do a bunch of stuff to improve, their performance in a number of areas. And it was, I think, 4 months into their year, and they had a whole bunch of about 20 odd strategic initiatives they were supposed to be doing, and they hadn't made a start on any of them. And they were wondering, well, why is this? Is it just that we don't have project management discipline, or that we don't, we can't, in the jargon now, execute, or what's going on here? And I basically just got them to stand up in turn in the group in a kind of safe, relatively safe environment, and say, okay, tell us, you've got 2 minutes without any prompts and PowerPoint slides and all that nonsense to tell us about the strategic initiative that you are on the hook for as the champion of. And tell us why it's important and why we should care. And each one in turn stood up, and you could just see from everything they said, their body language, they just didn't care. They were actually not interested in the initiative. And it got to the end, and there was this kind of deathly quiet. And I went out on a limb and I said, well, okay, it sounds like none of you care about any of those things. So stop doing them because you're not making any progress anyway. And I said, what's the number one thing that if you did it would materially change what it's like to be here and how the performance is? And they immediately all named the same thing, which they weren't working on because of all the 20 initiatives they also weren't working on. And it's like, well, do that. And I'll come back in 2 months and see you. And I came back and they said, oh, look, we did it in 2 weeks. And so we moved on to the next thing. And it's that. I mean, that's an extreme example. But although I do tend to find myself with organizations that have reached a kind of paralysis for the number of projects they've got going on and project meetings where none of them make any progress at all. But it's a strange role, I guess. But it's that point about actually they do need to care. And I think that's also something that leaders can find difficult. Some of the stuff they have to do, they might not personally enjoy, and they might feel unhappy about, particularly if it involves adversely some of the staff they care about and this sort of stuff. But they do actually have to care about what they're trying to achieve. And if they don't have that, they're not going to get anywhere. I mean, even if they do it the more conventional route, they're not going to inspire anyone. I remember there was way back when I worked for a large consultancy, there's one of the partners came in and wanted to talk to us about this thing he said was one of the most fantastically important initiatives that they had going on. So we sat there and this guy came in and he was downcast, never raised his eyes from the floor, clearly extremely unhappy to be there and clearly not interested in this initiative. And so, the words were, this is really important. Everything else was, no, it isn't. And everyone just kind of looked at each other and shrugged. It didn't go anywhere.
And I was giggling because it took me back, and listeners that used to work with me, I'm not going to name the institution, may remember this incident, but there was a sort of big presentation around a sort of restructuring of things. And it was literally the senior person there said something along the lines of, right, okay, so that's done. I'm off to do something important now. And the whole message was, I've been wasting my time standing in front of you lot. And it was just reminding me of that story, because it's sort of, we can read whether people are authentic or not. We're very good at sussing that out for ourselves. And it strikes me that lots of organizations unnecessarily foist things on people that sort of, don't get that individual's buy-in. So either the thing that they're being asked to do hasn't been sold properly to them, they haven't had it explained to them as to why it's important, or the thing is actually irrelevant and the person who's being asked to do it has sussed out that it's irrelevant. And I find it very strange because we hire people ostensibly in the knowledge economy because they're smart and they're intelligent and they can use judgment and all those things. And yet when it comes to sort of those interhuman connections and having a sense of purpose, that seems to go by the wayside. And it's kind of like, we need to do this important project, so we'll do it. And if it doesn't come with a sense of authenticity and genuine drive, and the person, if we don't care about something, as you say, we tend not to do it that well. And I find it fascinating that this point gets missed, because when you describe it the way that you did, it's blindingly obvious that if you don't have the people on board, then it's not going to be done properly, because that's how we operate as humans in any other context. But for some reason, that doesn't seem to always carry through in a kind of work context.
It's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, one of my colleagues, 30 years ago now, did a lot of research on this, and came up with a very simple model, which is helpful, I think. Simple classic 2x2, which essentially is the kind of willingness or an ability kind of dimension. But he was talking to a guy who headed up a new environmental energy company. And the guy was talking about, well, who are the kind of people I want to recruit into this company? And it was a really straightforward, lovely little model that I think is useful. And his model essentially was to say, look, I can recruit people because they have the right technical competence. Or I can recruit people because, I know it's an old-fashioned term, but their heart's in the right place. If I recruit people just on technical competence, then I'm going to spend the rest of my life looking over their shoulder and getting them to comply. It's that compliance thing again. If I get people whose heart's in the right place and who have, at least a baseline of ability, we can develop that. Obviously, the ideal is you get people in, kind of do well in both dimensions. but inevitably that's going to need some sort of development and support. But it was this clear marker of, which way you want to go. Do you want to make life hard and very unlikely to succeed? Or do you want to get the right people that you kind of have to almost be restraining them from rushing ahead with what it is you want them to be doing because they're so keen? And I know which way I would rather go.
But that's sort of harder to justify. And I think a lot of this decision-making comes down to defensibility. So if you hire someone who has tons of experience in this space, that's a defensible decision. Hire someone that is passionate but clueless. I mean, I would argue if they're passionate, you can teach them and they'll want to learn. And so you can compensate for that, as you were saying. But there is something about the decision-making process that makes it easier to justify the wrong outcome from what you've just described.
Yeah, we have to be realistic about it. Depends what role you're hiring for as well. So if you need to be able to get someone who drops straight in and runs with it, then, you're definitely looking for someone at the high end of the competence thing. However, I still would encourage you to go for someone who's also got the right attitudes and belief in what needs to be done. If you're hiring further down, then you do have the opportunity to develop people. But in a way, it comes back to you do at some point need to reflect what is most important. Is it having people who have the right attitudes and beliefs and mindset? Or do you just want people who are technicians at the end of the day?
Yeah, I was going to add brain surgery and other sort of very technical areas where you wouldn't want someone that's, you've never done this before, but have a crack at it, see how you get on. It's probably not the best approach for those safety critical missions.
But even there, though, so people, the classic example is you don't want a pilot, with his heart in the right place and no skills flying your plane. But, a friend of mine was leading the merger of a couple of airlines and asked me for some steers on how to get the pilots to collaborate, because they were still the kind of, we're from this firm side. And I said, just get them to do some best of groups around safety. They really care about safety. And they'll start talking about that and they'll forget the fact they're from different groups. So that's what he did, and it worked beautifully. It's like, there's still stuff that they're passionate about that you can work with. They don't do it just because they're ticking a box of safety procedures. They're doing it because they want to get themselves and their passengers alive to the other end.
I mean, it strikes me as you're talking, returning on that theme of structures. So we've looked at the sort of leadership model that says actually potentially the traditional views on that need to be challenged. I wonder what your thoughts were on things like job specs, because I've been reflecting on this thing and said, actually, if you look at the way the average job is constructed, we start from the premise of what does the organization need? And then we expect people to mold themselves to that. And then when we do the annual appraisal, we assess them based on how well they have squeezed themselves into the box that we've created for them. And recognizing that every single job needs, there are certain things that have to get done by someone. But it seemed to me that a much smarter way of getting the most out of your human capital, and I mean that in a positive sense, not exploiting them, but getting the best out of them, actually went on to start thinking about, job specs and what one asks people to do, and to, rather than have the individual mold themselves to the job, is to try and find the other way around, to try and find jobs that you can create around that. And it struck me that large swathes of the population spend a heck of a lot of time doing stuff that they are not good at, don't enjoy, just because it fits into a bigger piece. And so you might be senior enough to have the title. Maybe you understand that you've got enough experience to do broad swathes of it. But there are going to be things in that job that you're crap at, that you don't enjoy. And yet we sort of seem to force people to do that. And then we criticize them when they don't fit in with that. And it didn't seem to me to be a particularly positive way to get the best out of your human capital.
So I'm going to cover this a number of ways, and I hope that it's helpful to your listeners. So the first thing is, I'm mindful, having spoken in quite grandiose terms about the community idea, that it can sound very ethereal. At the end of the day, these ideas of needing to be passionate and work in a certain way with people actually really boil down to very concrete stuff. So one of the organizations I'm supporting at the moment, they're going through a transformation, and they're looking at recruiting for a whole bunch of new positions and how well their current staff fit. And so it's a situation I'm sure many people will recognize. But how this becomes concrete is that they're developing a series of essentially maps. I mean, they look visually a bit like a radar diagram, and some people might know them as a balanced scorecard. It says, look, you actually need, in the past, we've emphasized just the technical skills. What we're saying is you need skills, and we recognize there'll be levels of experience and skill along each dimension, but you need a number of dimensions. There's the leadership skills, problem solving, ability to include people, the ability to kind of coach and mentor and bring people on. So a whole bunch of things in addition to technical skills. And having that map and saying, okay, that translates actually into job descriptions and recruitment profiles for the new posts. We wanted people to demonstrate that they've got that roundedness. And that will involve, and that's another part of the process, what's the assessment of how you recruit people. So in jobs where this is important, they'll include an assessment where you have to work with a team, so you can be observed working with a team and how well you work with that team and what your style of working is, as opposed to just sitting across from an interview panel and talking about your history. It's like, let us see the behavior of how you work with a group and how you coach someone. So there's a need to kind of invest in understanding, in the round, what sort of person do you want for your jobs? And what does someone have to have and be in order to succeed in that role? And how then do we assess that? So there's a lot of very precise, concrete, hard work to be done to translate all these good intentions into practice. And it doesn't always sit well with the existing kind of HR and recruitment processes. So, that can be a challenge too. But in terms of these sort of simple models, I think, I carry around quite a lot of simple models in my head to help people get their heads around stuff. And it's like, look, if you want to get people to do stuff and, get what you want, you need to do three things. You need to be really clear what action you want them to take. You need to support them so that they're enabled to do that action. And then you do need to keep some sort of track and accountability and hold them to account. You need to do all those three things. And people fall over usually at one or more of those things. So it's not clear what you want people to do, or it's clear, but a level that's inappropriate. So you're not setting a direction, you're setting a too precise mind goal, for example. Or conversely, you're not being clear enough in some cases. You're not necessarily giving them the support you want, and you may not have the appropriate process to kind of keep track and keep developing them. When you do have those processes, sometimes or too often, they are punitive. So they're not a developmental thing. They are, kind of, did you hit this tick bash, punishment reward stuff. One of the things that very concretely the community approach does is it hits all of those levers. Because with the right community, the community develops real clarity around what the action needs to be. The community provides support for individuals and for the people working together in how they do that so they can do it. And the community holds people to account as well. So it's enormously powerful. You also don't actually have much option because it's simply not feasible for someone sitting high up in a hierarchy to do the appropriately granular determination of what actions people need to take, what support they need, and how they're kept accountable. You have to some extent devolve away people figuring out what they need to do, getting what they need to do it, and being held accountable, but in a developmental way. So it just doesn't work to do a kind of command and control, and the idea of deconstructing goals is just a nightmare. It also becomes incredibly static because I suppose one of the assumptions I have in all of this, which may not apply to you, is you don't have years to do this stuff. Way back when I did some work with the government department, it took them 5 years to figure out what kind of IT system they wanted. Another 5 years to implement it. It's like, well, guys, by the time you've implemented it, it's 10 years out of date. There needs to be a certain degree of agility here. Now, they have obviously changed vastly since then, but it still is true that organizations can work to a sort of what I think is a snail's pace. Now, I'm assuming that people need to and want to be able to turn on the sixpence. Well, you can't do that in a command and control organization. And those classic command and control organizations I've worked with, that people often say, oh yeah, but in this service you do need that. They know that you can't do it that way as well.
And as you were talking about sort of projects taking a lot of time, it always cracks me up with sort of airports being a good example. Where if you look at, Heathrow Terminal 5, as they were building it, they've had to add on extra terminal buildings because they didn't foresee the level of air travel. And I was giggling about that. And then I was thinking, but they also didn't foresee COVID. So maybe that, so again, to your point, is the world can change very, very rapidly. And okay, you can't put an airport up overnight. But I think a lot of these, there's almost a degree of rigor that sort of justifies delays. Well, we're doing this properly, so it's going to take some time. We're going to go through due process. And therefore, that is equated with better decision-making. And sort of, we've done this properly and thoroughly and done a proper thorough review. And of course, as you point out, is time nowadays particularly is of the essence. And you need to be able to react quickly to things within a short time frame, because actually that is an existential risk. And now governments, you might say, well, can get away with this a bit more. But I do find it fascinating that we somehow associate quick decision making and efficiency sometimes with sort of, well, that's going to be a bit slapdash and quick. But actually, to your point, you can get prevarication and procrastination doesn't necessarily deliver the outcomes either.
No, and I think something I hear in what you're saying is, which would be a reasonable question for people, is if you adopt the kind of more collaborative approach, will that work? Will it deliver the kind of very definite outcomes you need in particular situations? And the classic ones are things like construction. But my experience is, and this may be very counterintuitive, but actually you get a much better result in especially hard situations. And I think there's a kind of inevitability about that, because if you don't go down the collaborative, creative route, whether you choose to call it community or not, you're going to make dreadful mistakes. And I'm mindful that, some decades ago now, I worked with the group that was responsible for planning development of the North Circular around London. And, talking to them about, so how do you see this thing developing? And they were working on the basis that essentially the growth in traffic that had historically been seen would simply continue on the same linear growth path. And they hadn't factored in things like changes to non-petrol vehicles, the rise in the cost of petrol, so less travel, more working from home. There were countless variables that were entirely predictable and known that they were not able to factor in because they were not the right people to do that. Their skill was in essentially transport planning, but with a very specific set of disciplines. And it was only when they were able to have the conversations with folks. So I joined them up with the people who were planning the Olympics in London, so they could think about, okay, what's going to be the impact on traffic flows of the Olympics? And how do we, another aspect that needed to be factored in, which to be fair was at that stage only in its early stages, was how do we build better communities? And the way that you lay out roads has a massive effect on community building in local communities. So there needed to be a wide range of people coming from very different disciplines to figure out, okay, what's this thing going to look like in 20 years? I worked with a council in the Midlands on, what's your 20-year vision for what you want this community to be, across this fairly large geographic area. And that's everything from, transport to housing provision to healthcare provision and so on. And the only way we could do that was by having a series of really good conversations where there was everyone from councillors, Friends of the Earth, the local police, the transport providers, ordinary citizens, to the extent you can find ordinary citizens. And they have these fantastic creative conversations about, well, what sort of place do we want to live in? And if that's what we want, what do we need to make true over the coming years? What do we need to develop? So talking to school providers, healthcare providers, and so on. Stuff like where we're going to put the hospital, where we're going to put the county council. Some really big, impactful decisions that were not soft. And this is one of the things that I think people trip up on is it's like, oh, it's great to have this kind of community collaborative thing. You're dealing with nice soft stuff. It's like, no, it's especially important when you're dealing with hard stuff.
And what you're talking about there, in the sense of community, is just diversity of opinion. And I'm struck that the benefits of bringing in people with different perspectives and different areas of expertise is tremendously powerful. To the extent, one is it provides challenge to orthodox thinking, but secondly, something that's been done in a completely different context may have validity. You just need to think about it. It wouldn't occur to you to get the idea from that. And it always struck me that things like biomimicry, where we go and let's have a look and see how Mother Nature has solved a particular problem, can influence architecture, fashion, a whole host of different things in the human world that we sort of we can just borrow liberally from there. And I think there's this fascinating idea of sort of saying, actually, we need a broader coalition of minds on topics, because actually, if we want to break out of the conventional wisdoms that we were talking about, if we want to have alternative perspectives, and if we want to future-proof what we're doing, then actually it makes sense to have a broader range of people around the table, including some people you might not ordinarily have thought to invite.
Absolutely. And you've reminded me of, there's a very important article, it's a long time ago now, but it still resonates. I think it was called An Architect Looks at Organizational Design. But anyway, this guy was building a huge school in Japan. And when it was ready to be opened and he was showing people around, they noticed there were no paths anywhere. And he said, well, let's see where people walk and we'll put the paths there. A very simple idea, but against the norm for how you build schools. But I think it really works well. So even now, there's a group I'm working with, and they're working with that idea. So they're not trying to define every last dot and cross every T of how their new organization is going to work and what are going to be procedures for X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, let's see how people do it. So let's allow for evolution there. And a realization in this instance that if they do make the mistake of trying to preordain everything, they'll be dead within a couple of years because they won't have the necessary agility.
And it's fascinating. I love sort of showing pictures in presentations. I do, which is the opposite of that thing you were talking about with the path, which I think I can't remember if it's IT or something. But the idea of paving the cow paths. So let's wait to do the paving until the cows have shown us the way they. Well, I'm not sure cows like paving, but anyway, that's the broad principle. But I really like this. I love this idea of sort of actually, if you try and design things for the way you would like people to behave, you're stuffed because they're going to behave the way they're going to behave. So why don't we design things for the way they are likely to behave, and then work with that. And sometimes that you can sort of go, well, that's a pain because that human being is being inefficient and they're not doing the thing that I want and they're not following but actually there will be a reason for it. And I think there's this lovely idea of sort of, if we want to get the most out of people and we want to give them the best we can, then we have to recognize that the foibles of the human mind actually sometimes produces some really smart thinking. We are equipped with an ability to do amazing things. Now, sometimes we are stupid and we need rallying away from stupidity. But I think I love this idea of sort of actually just let's make things more human and let's reflect a little bit more around the realities of human decision making, as opposed to trying to put it into straitjackets. And I think this straitjacketing, we all hate that. We all don't know. None of us likes being told what to do, and you kind of know this intuitively when you come up against some petty bureaucrat that is sort of being deeply irritating. We know that's annoying, and we know we try and find ways around it. And I think it's fascinating that we don't often learn the lessons from the real world when it comes to looking within organizations. We sort of make the presumption that you've walked in through the door, you've logged into the system, you're a different person, you're now an employee, and you will do the company's bidding. And I think it's funny because we don't switch that gene off. It's not like we sort of sit there and go, I'm now in an environment where I will accept everything and I will stop thinking for myself, particularly where I've been told that I've been hired precisely because I've been through a rigorous interview process and they want me for me and all those sorts of things. So I think it's fascinating, all of the things you're talking about is really saying, how do we make organizations and decision-making more human?
Yes, it really is. And I was most amused you were talking about wanting people to comply absolutely with what we want them to do. And my immediate reaction was, good luck with that. I think it is about making things more human. It just seems bizarre, doesn't it, that we want people and we want them to bring themselves to work and all of their ingenuity and experience. And then we suddenly say, yeah, but we don't really want that. We want a machine. It's just bizarre. And I'm not quite sure why it is. It's back, earlier on I was saying, I often have the question for people, why do you continue to do stuff in a way you know doesn't work? And I think we do cycle back to questions of confidence and control. Trust is a big one, of course. Do you trust people? But it can be a lot about, I don't feel in control because this person has autonomy. And I'm worried that someone's going to ask me if I know exactly what they're doing and I won't be able to say yes. So there's some very, again, it's back to being human. The reason that in a way we get this is because people are being human. They're not willing to work with people in a way that they would work with them casually every day if they were on the same football team or something like that. And it's a curious thing. I think it can be quite a hard journey for organizations. A lot of it is about building trust and safety, I think. And building trust is a complex thing. I mean, breaking trust down is a tricky thing. There have been lots of people who've tried to do that. I mean, I think there's a bunch of factors that contribute to whether or not you trust someone. And I think let's just distinguish trust from whether you like someone or not, because I think you can trust someone but not necessarily like them. And conversely, you can like them but not necessarily trust them, which can be a bit awkward. But the trust thing, I think there's a number of things that go on in that. And if we think about the sort of typical sort of people that folks say they don't trust, like estate agents or politicians or something like that, there are a number of ways you can think about that. But the useful one is to think, look, trust really is a function of a bunch of things. And for me, part of that is, do you have a shared intention? Do you fundamentally believe that they want the right thing, or to use the old-fashioned language, that their heart's in the right place? And then when it comes to the work environment, it's going beyond that and saying, okay, so that's true, but do they have the right capability? So do I trust they have the right ability to do that thing, even if they want to? And if they don't, well, we can work on that to an extent. And then actually, whatever we say about is their heart in the right place and do they have their capability, let's watch what they do. So let's look at how they behave over time. So this is where you get into the classic thing about people talk a good talk, but watch their feet. So if I'm looking at, do I trust someone? It's like, what did they want? And is it aligned with what I think we should be doing together? Or, yeah, we may not have the same intentions, but do I believe that actually they're sincere and honest about what they're saying they want to achieve? Do I think they can do it? And actually, irrespective of all of that, what's their behavior over time? It's like, yeah, they keep saying that they want to do this, and they certainly have the ability, but watch what they actually do in practice. So a classic example, and I have encountered this myself, is the boss who will talk about how times are hard, and outside he gets into his brand new BMW and drives off, and doesn't understand why that's not a good look.
I mean, it's when you depict it in those terms, though, it's sort of, I come back to this sort of, it's something that we all grow. We all have a sense of sort of, does this feel right? And that's to do with fairness, but it's also to do with sniffing out whether is this person lying to me? Does this feel like an environment I'm comfortable with? And I find it very interesting when we think about that. It's to your point, it's sort of almost like, the way many roles and companies are structured is there is an implicit or explicit requirement for you to switch some of that stuff off and become, turn off some of those faculties that you've got, because that doesn't help us in our objective. And I think actually, if you want your organization to succeed in the 21st century, you need it to be alive to these things. you can no longer be tone deaf to the real world in a way that you might be able to before. And that's partly to do with the internet and transparency. There are social trends underpinning that. There's a nature, even the dynamic now of having lots of people working from home where they're no longer in the office. So you sort of, in theory, if you're an old school person, I've lost a little bit of control there. So we've got this there's a greater connectivity, I would say, with the real world, a greater sense of companies having a purpose. All of these things point towards, back to the earlier point, is more humanity. And yet, as you say, there's a lot of switching of these, switching that off and sort of hoping that, being blind to hoping that we don't want too much. We'll have a little bit of that. We don't want too much of that.
Well, I'm certainly hoping that some of the dynamics we have in play at the moment, the obligation to work from home, has forced trust, actually, and consumer choice, where consumers are increasingly choosing to buy from companies that they feel have a sort of purpose and way of working that they feel aligned with, will drive change. But it's a curious thing because, yes, we can get into these conversations where people will say, well, all this stuff about trust and good intentions, it's all a bit kind of soft and touchy-feely. And then you can go, well, hang on a minute. The way you work now is based on more or less subconscious by this stage assumptions, which are you don't believe people's hearts in the right place and you don't trust them. Because if you did, you wouldn't ask them to fill out a timesheet for every 7 minutes and clock in and out and do a whole bunch. You wouldn't be tracking their keyboard presses and all this stuff. So if actually the way you work demonstrates that you fundamentally don't trust your staff. And that's quite an awkward conversation to have. But, and part of the awkwardness is that what they're doing now is already being driven by whether or not they trust their staff and whether or not they believe there's a shared purpose. So I'm just saying, well, make that stuff explicit. Get a bit smarter about this stuff.
And do you think it's that some companies can't do that because actually that wouldn't be authentic? So I can't say that I trust my staff because frankly I don't. And so we've built up, it seems to me there's a lot of structures that have been built that are really unhelpful in that regard, in that there's a huge disconnect between the stated objectives and the stated kind of purpose and the way we do business, all those sorts of things, and the reality on the ground.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, certainly there's a couple of ways coming at that. One is if you don't trust your staff, then you have a problem. And no amount of compliance work is going to fix that. You have a problem that is going to kill you. Does it come from history? Yes. A number of organizations still living in kind of the 19th century. I find this strangely with banks. I find myself having this very serial experience where I'll go back to banks that I haven't been into for 10 or 20 years and bank head offices. And it's like, well, goodness, they still feel like the 1980s or 1990s and stuff has not moved on here. And, that's not good. Well, surprise, these places are being eaten alive by modern competitors that kind of appear out of nowhere. Well, they don't come out of nowhere. If you're actually looking around, you'd spot them coming. So back to the whole kind of collaborative sharing of mind stuff. And they're being eaten alive because these guys are much more agile. They have a very different workforce. We see it playing out in our everyday. So if we look at supermarkets in the UK, for example, you'll see that there are sort of battles playing out between the likes of, say, Lidl and Sainsbury's. And there are, you could look at that from a number of different lenses, but one of the useful lenses, I think, is that a lot of supermarkets have a very command and control structure. Some, to be fair, have got a really impressive different style and way of doing things. Some years ago, I was in a large supermarket, I won't name, and there was a kind of visit by area managers, and they just whisked through like kind of grand royalty, sort of doing a kind of tour and, sort of being kowtowed to and whisked out again. And then I was in another one, which I will name because I was so impressed, which is Tesco's. And the area manager was walking around and he didn't know that there was anyone else there looking at him. So he was just behaving naturally, but I wasn't looking at him. And when he found chewing gum on the floor, he got on his knees and he scraped it off with his fingernails. And I thought, this is a very different place. So, and I've seen that kind of behavior replicated in many other cases as well. But now, if you look at someone like Lidl, they're coming in with a very different model of how to do stuff. So they're a Velcro organization, so very flat. Everyone can do everything and everyone expects to do everything. Very different buzz there, very different conversation with people working on the tills, managers, whatever. Everyone is just pitching in. And I know which organization I would put my money on to win.
And as you were talking, it's fascinating. So there's an earlier episode of the podcast I'll point to in the show notes with Professor Josephine Nelson, who looks specifically at surveillance in the workplace. And what she says is a lot of the language and the processes and the logic behind this comes from slavery. And so, that's where the original let's keep an eye on what our employees are up to because we can't trust them idea comes from. And there's a lot more than we give credit to that comes from that space. And she says, that was not a particularly respectful relationship from employer to employee. Not employment is probably even the wrong word there. And I think it's fascinating that to your point is we, you need those controls in place when the underlying dynamics are such that there is zero trust there. If those underlying dynamics are there, you can move to that fluid model. And I think it's fascinating when you talk about everybody mucking in, because that's kind of what a good functioning family does. And so we recognize that in other contexts as being effective. So why wouldn't a similar thing work on a supermarket floor? We see it working in sports teams. You can have a team full of individual rock stars, but actually if they're not gelling as a team, not going to help you. Whereas the team of slightly less talented players that work together will perform more effectively. So again, we know this from the real world, and yet it doesn't seem to have always penetrated in the workspace.
Well, so to be fair, a number of different things here. So one is, it takes time to change. One of the ideas that influenced me way back when was the notion that there is a speed of change. So it takes a certain amount of time to change. And what organizations don't realize, and I've now encountered this so many times, is you're kind of dead before you know it because you can't change in the time that's left to you. And so can you change fast enough to survive? What this leads to is there's a concept of the zombie organization. And this is one of these things I'm never happy to say, but I do look around and there are organizations which are zombie organizations because they're dead. They just don't know it yet. And because they will not be able to change in the time that's left. And I think that, that's a tragic thing to do. And one of the things we can do with that is help people in their transition to a better place. The other point that you prompted, and I know this can be a really awkward discussion, but by the conversation about slavery, is we do need to talk about race and gender. So there is a terrible problem with race and gender bias in leadership and management. So it's not just that we're working with all of our staff are kind of indentured servants, but in particular, there is terrible underrepresentation of ethnic minorities and women. And I think we know by now pretty conclusively that those organizations that have more women in them, surprise, do better. It's a bit like my joke about it is, you've got some guy with a really macho bachelor pad, but when he gets a spouse or partner, it suddenly becomes a much nicer place to live. So it's a terrible sexist thing to say probably, but there is a thing about you need different energies and different outlooks. And, with the best way in the world, as a white male, there's a limit to how variable my perspectives can be. There are certain lived experiences I don't have. I am not the right person to help certain groups develop. They need to be talking to their peers or simply have the choice about who do we want to listen to. So cycling back to my focus on communities, one of the things that drives that is the realization that if I want to get people to do stuff, yes, they need to want to do it. They need to be properly supported and they need to be held accountable. But I am not the right person to do any of those things. The person they need to listen to is the one that they trust, which may be the water cooler person or an immediate boss that they know well or a colleague of some kind. But it is the nature of things that we have to, I think as leaders, we need to say, look, I am not in a position to actually get a certain group of people to do something. I'm just not the right person. So who is the right person and how do I enable them? And so on. So it's much more about recognizing that you're sort of cultivating really quite a complex human network. I sort of joke about it being a human cellular network, but it is, I think. Do you understand that? Do you understand what the nodes are? Do you understand what the energies are flowing around that? Can you work with that? Can you know when to push and when to back off? Can you provide the right kind of steer? Do you have the humility? Do people trust you? It's quite a lot of stuff to think about, and it's hard. Someone wrote an article, terrible article, good title, called "The Soft Stuff is the Hard Stuff," and I think that is true. People do all this kind of hard technical stuff. Actually, that's easy. The hard stuff is all this trust, behavior, understanding human dynamics. That it's really hard.
I think that is a fantastic note on which to end things, because it's just such a great point. And look, it's been an absolutely inspirational conversation. We've touched on so many different topics, and I knew it was going to be a meander through all sorts of interesting areas, but you've come up with some great anecdotes and some fascinating food for thought. I will put details of how people can get hold of you, because I think you would have stimulated lots of interest of people in their companies in the show notes. But in the meantime, Jean-Marc, thank you so much for appearing on the podcast.
Well, Christian, it's been a delight talking to you as ever. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Jean-Marc for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about some of the subjects we discussed in the episode, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. A quick reminder to you that there's that new edition of the second ever episode of the show with Tom Harden that's available. Link to that in the show notes, but also you'll find it by scrolling back to the second episode in this series. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, if you're interested in human risk related topics and things like the Human Risk video blog and newsletter, visit human-risk.com. As ever, if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please feel free. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.